Is this working? Oh, it's working. Yeah, we're good. I'm going to go ahead and call the Linguistics Colloquium to order. It's great to see everybody. I'm going to begin by reading out the house rules. This is for folks in person, but also relevant for folks joining us on Zoom. Hi, where's the camera? Yes. Hey, guys. Thanks for coming. So closed captioning is available via human transcription, real-time transcription. You click that CC button at the bottom of your window to enable that. When it comes to the Q&A at the end of the presentation, we ask that you write questions you might have for our presenter into the Zoom chat or use the Q&A feature to write your question. And the committee here in the room will read that question out to have a lively conversation. If you do have any technical issues, you won't have any tech. No, if you have technical issues, you should put that through the chat. And we have folks here who are working hard to make sure everything runs smoothly. So thank you. Thank you. Next slide. I do it. I'm good. Sorry. This thing? It is on. It is on. And I even have it here. Okay, this is fantastic. Okay, so the Department of Linguistics recognizes the University of Michigan's origins on a land grant from the Anishinaabe, including Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi, and the Wendat. The university continues to exist on the historical territory of the Anishinaabe people. Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi are collectively called Anishinaabemowin, and they belong to the Algonquin language family. And there are currently 12 recognized Anishinaabe tribes in the state of Michigan. Many Anishinaabe people living throughout the state and interacting at the University of Michigan. So with those kind of initial remarks, I want to introduce our presenter. Is this the point where recording starts? Is there a thing that happens, or is that it's already been recording? So no pause required. Okay. So I'm really excited. I'm really thrilled to that we are able to host Dr. Myles Durkee for our linguistics colloquium today. Our colleague in the psychology department. He is an assistant professor of psychology, where he joined the faculty in 2017. He earned his PhD at the University of Virginia in educational psychology in 2013, followed by postdoctoral work at the University of Chicago and also here at the University of Michigan. Dr. Durkee's work focuses broadly on the psychology of identity, discrimination, prejudice, and bias. I'm going to use your own words. I think they describe beautifully this research program to examine how people of color navigate racial contexts, modify their racial behavior to fit in certain contexts, and internalize messages about their cultural authenticity from individuals inside and outside their racial group. Such navigation includes linguistic vehicles such as code switching and other aspects of interaction. This research portfolio is, I mean, from my perspective, enviable, with publications spanning venues in psychology, in medicine, in education. And I wanted to remark especially on the impressive number of mentees that Dr. Durkee has brought onto his research projects and that are featured in these publications, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. So it's amazing support on multiple fronts. The work, of course, has been recognized with awards from the University of Michigan, from the American Psychological Association, funding from U of M's advanced program and the OVPR and a National Center for Institutional Diversity Anti-Racism grant, and media coverage from the Chronicle of Higher Ed, Business Insider, Forbes, the BBC, other outlets that you've never heard of. So please, with that, join me in welcoming Dr. Myles Durkee for his presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John, for the kind introduction. Okay, so I'm assuming everyone can hear me well, right? In the back? Okay. All right, next slide. All right, so first I want to say thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you all today. I have to admit, I'm a little intimidated because this is the first time I presented my work on code switching to linguists, all right? So I have to give you a disclaimer that I'm coming at code switching from a psychological perspective. So we'll kind of dive into that a little bit in the presentation as in terms of, as a psychologist, how we tend to approach the topic of code switching. But for today's talk, we're going to focus specifically on racial code switching and the psychological and cognitive consequences of racial code switching. All right, so typically for most spaces I'm in, we have to start with definitions of what code switching is, but this might be the first space I presented in where I'm assuming that everyone in this room has probably heard the term code switching before and has a definition of code switching they can easily rattle off. So let's just dive right into it. So as you know, the term code switching, it was coined in your field in linguistics. And traditionally, code switching was used to define the practice of alternating between two or more languages within a single conversation. So sociolinguists then expanded this definition of code switching to also include alternating between different dialects, even within the same language. So realizing that even native English speakers can still switch between different versions and dialects of English, depending on who they're interacting with, or even within the same conversation. So that can include African-American English compared to mainstream American English, or English that's based on the dialects of other cultural groups within the United States. All right, so now coming as a psychologist, we tend to define code switching a little more broadly, all right? So we still recognize that some of the core tenets of code switching are still in our communication styles, how we communicate with other individuals. But we broaden this definition to also include style of speech, but also your behavior, your mannerisms, your repertoire, and also your appearance, in the spirit of trying to mirror the social norms and expectations of other individuals, okay? So when we define code switching from a psychological perspective, we think of code switching as your entire self-presentation, where in addition to how you're communicating with other individuals, it's also your presentation and how you're presenting yourself to the world. So that includes not only your style of dress, it includes your hair selection, whether you choose to wear a more natural hairstyle for your cultural group, or to change your hairstyle to fit more of a European aesthetic, which can be straightening your hair or chemically processing your hair. That can also be in your selection of jewelry, whether you prefer to wear more ethnic cultural jewelry or you prefer to tone it down to kind of fit the context that you're interacting with. It can also even go down to the point of your handshake. So how you greet someone else, you can code switch your handshake. So if you're greeting me, I can give you the standard, let's say American handshake, or we can dap it up and we can have a very different handshake. So speaking of handshakes, I did a random deep dive a few weeks ago and found that even when it comes to the dap, which is more of a African-American style of handshake, there's also very different types of dap depending on which region of the United States that you're in. The dap is not created equally. So where I'm from in Los Angeles, we usually ended our dap with a snap right at the end of it, but they don't do it as much on the East Coast, I've noticed. And even within LA too, certain parts of the city, people would give you certain gestures in the dap to indicate what neighborhood they're from. So a lot of information can be communicated even from a handshake, but there's a lot of cultural variation. So that itself is another form of code switching as well. Okay, so I'm gonna try to make this presentation as interactive as possible. So at several points throughout the presentation, we're gonna have a question time and everyone's gonna get a chance to participate, all right? Even folks in the back, the last row, I still see you. All right, so here's our first question, all right? We can just do by a show of hands. So in thinking about code switching, and when you think about code switching, I want you to keep in mind that you can code switch across all of your social identities, okay? So in the presentation I'm giving today, I'll be focusing primarily on racial code switching because that's the type of work that my lab conducts. But we know in society, code switching happens across every other social identity as well. So in terms of gender, women have been code switching in the workplace for centuries. Even in academia specifically, we only have to go back maybe 50 years where academia was very male dominated and women were code switching in that space to fit into a very male dominated environment. If we go to corporate America, particularly the boards of Fortune 500 companies, these are still very male-dominated spaces where women are almost expected to code switch in those dynamics to accommodate the norms of men. In terms of other social identities, we know across sexuality, there's an expectation to code switch in spaces where you're numerically underrepresented to accommodate the majority group. Even in terms of religious background, socioeconomic status, even what's a peculiar one, even geographic region within the United States. So when we think about the dialects of English, for an example, even white individuals from the South who speak more of a Southern twang of English, we know that that Southern accent can be stigmatized in other parts of the United States and be perceived as less educated. So as individuals leave the South and move out, they might encounter pressure to code switch to try to suppress that Southern accent. So I want you to keep in mind of these social identities, okay? So let's go ahead and get some participation. So across your myriad of different social identities, during your week, how many people would say that they probably typically never notice themselves code switching? Show of hands. Okay. How about rarely? All right. Sometimes. Okay. Often. All right. Often is a popular one. How about always? Okay, got it. So often and always. Seems like often was definitely the most common response. All right. Oh, thanks for including that poll. I forgot the folks on Zoom. I don't know how to show the results though. So I don't know. Oh, there we go. I don't know if you all, if I move it over, I guess you can see how, there we go. Okay. So that's our folks on Zoom. Oh, we have 34 people on Zoom. Thank you all for tuning in today. All right. So it seems like sometimes and often we're also the most common responses for the Zoom group. Thank you. All right, so we're thinking about code switching. So we saw in this room that sometimes to often were typically the most common responses for code switching, but it brings up the question, in the United States, how common is code switching in general, and specifically racial code switching? How common is it amongst all Americans? So fortunately, to answer that question, in 2019, the Pew Research Center conducted a national poll of racial code switching across Americans, and they found some pretty interesting results, all right? So here's one of the tables from the report. So on average, they found that from a nationally representative sample, that 36% of Americans reported racially code switching either often or sometimes, okay? And in the survey, they define code switching as changing the way you express yourselves when around people of different racial or ethnic backgrounds, okay? So you can see the way they define themselves as just expressing yourself. So that expressing yourself can include both linguistically your style of speech, but that can also include your entire self-presentation. So they're really using more of like a psychological, I would say, definition of code switching in the way they framed it in changing your entire self-presentation when interacting with members of different racial groups. All right, so they did find some racial differences though. So when we look at people of color, specifically Black and Hispanic Americans, we find that on average, 40% of these groups reported code switching, either often or sometimes. But what was really interesting is that there was a large educational gap in the code switching rates for Black Americans. So for the Black Americans in the study who were college educated, nearly half of all of them sampled reported racially code switching either often or sometimes, okay? So that's a good amount, nearly half of this population reporting code switching. And keep in mind, for college grads, most of these individuals are probably very likely to go into professional careers. And these are likely careers where they may be in the severe numerical minority, where they may be the only individual from their background in meetings or on these potentially corporate boards. All right, so to get a better sense of what code switching looks like in real life, I'm gonna play a quick video for you that's just a few minutes, but it kind of gives you some context to situate some of the pressures that particularly African Americans encounter when it comes to pressure to engage in racial code switching.
We all code switch, but some examples are more effective than others.
Okay, let's be real honest. Obama would not be president if he didn't know how to effectively code switch.
Obama out.
He's really adept at reading his audience.
Wagwan, Jamaica.
And then putting forth an American English that they can relate to.
So what is code switching?
Okay, so code switching, let's keep it really simple. Code, so we can think language, and switching, so going back and forth between one language and another, or one dialect and another.
Meet Professor Renee Blake.
I am an associate professor in the Department of Linguistics at New York University. I'm also in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis and the Director of Africana Studies.
Say that 3 times fast.
Oh, you're funny. Code switching is the norm for all of us. So if you just think about whether it's a formal situation versus an informal situation, we're going to be code switching. Usually people think of it in terms of language. So here I am speaking, and I'm speaking not only with words, but I'm also speaking with my face, I'm speaking with my hands.
But code switching often has higher stakes for Black people.
I think it's clear why Black people specifically feel the need to code switch.
This is Taryn Finley. She's the editor of HuffPost Black Voices.
Our Blackness isn't accepted in a lot of spaces that are critical for our success and our survival. A lot of times we have to dilute and we have to put on a mask.
It's a bigger leap for someone who speaks African American English versus someone who speaks a language that is closer to mainstream English, the language of those in power.
But when a Black person can't effectively code switch, the result can be catastrophic.
All right, so in the research I'm going to be sharing with you all, we're going to be focusing on the implications of code switching, specifically amongst Black Americans. But before we jump into that research, I wanted to talk about some conceptual frameworks first and situate the work within some theory. So we situate code switching corely within impression management theory. So impression management theory is a very broad, large theory, but we feel that code switching is one of the core tenets within impression management theory. So this theory was basically pioneered by Erving Goffman, who's really the godfather of impression management theory. He's a psychologist, and in his writing, he defines impression management as intentional efforts to reveal certain aspects of the self while simultaneously concealing other aspects, all right? So one easy way to think about impression management is your self-presentation. And he uses this term self-presentation interchangeably with impression management. So your self-presentation is how you present yourself to the world the moment you leave your home. So it's how you carry yourself, your mannerisms, the certain type of impression that you want to send to certain individuals. So as human beings, as we move between different contexts, different spaces, interacting with our partners, our roommates versus going to work, interacting with our colleagues, our bosses, we're going to give slightly different versions of ourselves depending on those contexts and the expected roles of us in that space. All right. So impression management itself is universal for all human beings, okay? We all engage in impression management strategies, particularly when we're under situations where we know where we're gonna be evaluated, such as like a job interview or a performance evaluation or giving a colloquium talk is another example. And in Goffman's writing, one great analogy that he uses is that he oftentimes describes impression management as essentially all human beings. He describes us as essentially actors on stages, okay? So as we go about throughout our day, we're moving from different stages, but in each stage that we're performing on, because he considers when we're interacting in public as a performance, we have to play a certain character and get into a certain role. But what he emphasizes is that once you're on that stage and in that role, you have to stay in character. And I want to emphasize the aspect of staying in character, because that also creates a dynamic of where code switching can start to become stressful and taxing. Because for those who do decide to engage in code switching, once you decide to start code switching in a particular environment or a stage, you have to stay in character. Because the moment that you drop out of a character or break character, you're going to confuse and lose your audience. Because now they're going to be wondering, okay, which version am I getting? You're a different person now. You're not the person that I've been used to. So for example, if an individual decides to code switch, it's not that they can decide to stop code switching on Fridays, but then code switch at work Monday through Thursday, because that sends very mixed signals to their colleagues. So they do have to stay in that role. And when we think about code switching, although it's a universal dynamic for all individuals, there's still very wide degrees of individual difference, all right? And we find that our social identities matter a great deal in determining some of this wide range of individual difference. So along our social identities, groups that are positioned in lower positions of power, groups that are more marginalized, the stakes and the pressure to code switch are often higher for those individuals, because now the motivation for code switching is trying to, in a way, almost overcompensate for the negative stigma that others have put on their group. So you're trying to change the way that you're perceived by others, manage those impressions by mirroring the norms and attributes of the dominant group in the spirit of gaining inclusion, access, acceptance, or for hopefully in the spirit of lessening future discrimination against you from the majority group. So within impression management theory, there's many different forms of how individuals manage their impressions. We argue that code switching is one of these main pillars of impression management and how people shift between different versions of themselves and different profiles, essentially, different self-presentations, but also other constructs that have been studied widely include emotional masking. So a lot of the work on emotional masking has been done with women in the workforce, identifying that historically, a lot of the times when women were in the workforce, there's expectation for them to always have a smile and be happy and be optimistic, no matter what was happening in that day, whether they're working a double shift or just being exhausted that day, having to always present themselves in a happy-go-lucky way, regardless of the true emotions they were feeling. This is also very relevant for positions which are very customer-facing. So in hospitality positions or administrative or secretarial positions where you literally can be the voice of the company, the expectation to have to mask and present a positive emotion throughout the workday. And then passing is another way of impression management. So those who have more, let's say, subtle or ambiguous phenotypes that can potentially pass under different identity groups, that can be an opportunity. Or if it's a marginalized identity that's not phenotypically based, then that's another opportunity where individuals may intentionally or be expected or forced to pass under a different identity than the true identity they belong to or identify with. All right, so let's have another question time. All right, so this time the question is, during a regular week, who do you code switch most often around, okay? So this time for the folks in the room, you can select multiple options, okay? If multiple options apply to you. But sorry, for the folks on Zoom, if we can do another poll, I think you might only be allowed to respond to one. So for the folks in the room, how many people feel that they code switch, let's say, most often around your supervisors? Okay, we got a few. How about colleagues or classmates? Okay, friends or peers? Got it. Okay, we're getting some great variance in this room. I like that. How about family members? Okay, family members are pretty common. All right. And then how about security or law enforcement? Okay, that was some great distribution. So kudos to everyone in the room who participated. All right, so basically the takeaways from each of these. Okay, let's look at the Zoom poll. All right, so wow, 47% of those on Zoom say colleagues and classmates, followed by 22% of supervisors, and then 19% family members. Okay, got it. So pretty good variance there. All right, so the lesson to take away from this question is that each of these sources of relationships we have can be situations in which we can face some pressure, or there can be social cues to engage in code switching. But that code switching can look quite differently depending on these sources. So when we think about code switching, we typically think about code switching from a group that may be in a lower position of power or more marginalized, code switching towards the dominant group, okay? Because the dominant group oftentimes has the power to dictate what's perceived as like the default, the norms of that context. But when it comes to family members, that can be a very different situation where sometimes family members can put pressure for individual to code switch back to their own racial in-group or cultural group or religious group. So we can see that code switching pressure, it can actually go both ways. So that's a really important point to consider. And as we get to the end of the presentation, I'm happy to talk more about that kind of the less focused dynamic of code switching, which some people call like reverse code switching, of code switching back to your own social identity groups that you identify with. All right, so when we think about these different individuals that people may code switch around, there's also very different power dynamics across each of these sources, all right? So when we talk about code switching, we have to also talk about power dynamics, because power dynamics plays such an important role on influencing the nature of code switching. All right, so a few particular frameworks that really enforce how these power dynamics kind of come about and inform code switching. The first is social identity theory from Todgeville and Turner. As a psychologist who studies a lot of identity dimensions, this is one of my favorite conceptual frameworks. But essentially, Todgeville and Turner argued that as human beings, we all naturally categorize ourselves into social groups that we identify with, all right? So these social groups are going to be based off our gender, our race, our political affiliations, our economic status. I mean, you name it, humans are really great at finding categories and groups to group people. It's kind of the way how our mind works in schemas. Even when we meet someone for the first time, even before they open their mouth and we see them, we're already grouping them into categories in our head. And the moment they speak, we're using that verbal information as well to further group them into other categories also. So it's kind of like the natural way human beings are wired. But what's really powerful from this framework is not only do we group people into these categories, but as human beings, we also draw a sense of our identity and even our self-esteem and self-concept from these groups that we identify with, all right? So as myself, I identify as African-American, male, Californian, but from all these identities, I draw a sense of pride from these identities, okay? And how it's informed my experience and my connection affiliation with these identities. So this group membership and the sense of pride that we form from these identities, it also has a very powerful influence on shaping our attitudes towards other groups. So if our group is also in the majority, then we may have more power to start to kind of dictate certain norms, but also have the power to then start putting that group in a higher social status and position of power relative to other groups. But it also influences our perceptions and our behaviors as well. All right, so it's really pulling from social identity theory. That's really where we get the basis of starting these power dynamics of social groups and how certain groups are positioned in higher positions of power in the way that they even view and relate to other groups that they may view as in lesser power or inferior in certain ways. So now if we combine this with intersectionality theory from Kimberly Crenshaw, and this theory argues that as individuals, we all have multiple social identities, but these identities intersect in really powerful ways to shape our experience with power, okay? So let's start with one identity. So within the United States, it's fairly safe to say that white Americans in the United States are in a position of power relative to other racial groups in the US, okay? But even if we look within white Americans, if we now intersect that with gender, white women have a very different relationship to power than white men do, okay? So now we're intersecting two identities, race and gender, but if we further compound that and add other identities, now let's focus on white men specifically, but if we compare heterosexual white men to gay white men, now we also have different relationships to power there as well too, and that's now three identities. So as we begin to intersect these identities, that intersection is really powerful because it really speaks to what that individual's relationship with power is going to be. And as individuals start to have more intersecting marginalized identities, that's going to most likely put them in a lower position of power, which may create higher stakes for them to feel that pressure to code switch. And when we talk about that pressure to code switch, we have to distinguish between voluntary code switching versus involuntary code switching. And this is really a recommendation for where this research on racialized code switching in general, where it needs to go. Because for voluntary code switching, this is typically the code switching that you'll see from individuals who are more in positions of power or in positions of being in the majority group. So typically in these situations, if the individual is already in a position of power, all human beings code switch to a certain degree. But typically for individuals in these positions, when they do code switch, typically that code switching is mostly being voluntarily driven, okay? They're choosing to code switch, but if they also chose not to code switch, there's usually going to be very little consequences, if at all. Now, if we flip that to other individuals who have more marginalized intersectional identities, they're going to face a lot more pressure for involuntary code switching. So now to gain access and inclusion into these spaces that are dominated by majority groups, oftentimes they're going to face that pressure to have to code switch to prove to the dominant group that I can talk like you, I can walk like you, I'm just as smart as you, I can carry myself just like you. Whether they want to do that code switching or not, there's more societal stakes and pressure to have to do that code switching. And if they choose not to do this code switching at all, then those consequences can also be a lot more severe as well. All right, so let's jump into some of the work that we've conducted. All right, so this, let's see. So this first set of results I'll present. So I want to highlight my collaborator, Dr. Courtney McClooney. She was an alumni, a doctoral student from our program in psychology. And she really was the catalyst that got me started on the code switching research. So prior to that, most of my work was looking at cultural invalidations and how individuals, their identities were targeted and invalidated. But in my conversations with her, we realized that code switching was a very common adaptive response to this type of identity threats. So to deter these identity threats, we noticed that individuals in our studies were shifting and adapting their behaviors to not only fit in with the dominant group, but also then to fit in with their own in-group as well too, and basically presenting themselves in very different ways. So Courtney went into the business school. She was a professor at Cornell in the B School. So she was very interested in how Black professionals were code switching at work. So we conducted a series of studies assessing Black professionals across the country, getting at their, one, to what degree do they code switch? And then really get at the psychology of how do they feel about that code switching? And I can go into a lot more detail afterwards in the Q&A about how they felt about that code switching. But okay, so long story short, let's talk about why do most individuals code switch at work? So I have to say this work is coming from Black professionals specifically. These results, we conducted a mixed method study with 300 Black professionals across the United States who were collected online. All of these Black professionals had at least a bachelor's degree. Most of them had an advanced graduate degree, and they were all employed full-time. And for this data was collected before the pandemic. So all of these Black professionals were working in person, okay? I feel like that matters now because now we're in a hybrid society for a lot of positions. So some of the individual motivators for why these Black professionals code switched. The first is that we found that those who reported having higher career and leadership aspirations of wanting to scale that corporate ladder, they reported code switching significantly more in their current occupations. Also, those who reported a higher perceived fit with the current company that they worked with, they also reported higher rates of code switching. And a lot of that code switching may be to maintain that good fit with the existing company culture that they've now found themselves in. And then what was really interesting is that, and this is a result that we've now replicated across several data collections, is that individuals who report higher levels of vigilance, they also consistently report higher levels of code switching, okay? So what is vigilance? Vigilance is the anticipation of negative treatment, negative experiences, or discrimination occurring before it ever happens, okay? So it's that vigilance of anticipating, kind of like that gut feeling you have that I think something bad might happen in a second, or I think I might be targeted in a way. That's vigilance right there, okay? So for these individuals who go to work and are a little more vigilant to expect that, okay, I might be discriminated against at work, or to have the perception that their work might be a hostile place, they tend to code switch at a significantly higher rate. So I want to give you a quote from one of our participants that kind of highlights this relationship between vigilance and code switching. So this individual says, "It has been my specific experience that it is simply easier to anticipate the complaints, jokes, and negative comments from white people and just adapt to their discomfort and ignorance in order to maintain workplace peace," okay? So I want to highlight the vigilance at first, which is the anticipation of the complaints, jokes, and negative comments. So this individual is anticipating it to occur. And then for the code switching, instead of kind of calling out those experiences, this individual is simply internalizing and adapting their own behavior in prioritizing the comfort of their colleagues, okay, in the spirit of trying to maintain that peace in the workplace. So let me change who I am and adapt my behavior to fit into this current workplace culture. All right, so other motivators we found for code switching were contextual motivators. So as I'm sure you all would expect, the racial composition of the workplace was a strong correlate of the rates of racial code switching. So let's do another quick spontaneous poll. Let's do a show of hands. How many people believe that for Black professionals who worked in predominantly white workplace contexts, do you think that they code switched at the highest rates? Any show of hands? So out of the different racial compositions, it can be heavily your own race, racially diverse, or predominantly white. So for those who worked in predominantly white spaces, how many people feel that they code switch the highest degree? Any takers? Okay, we got a few. All right, so we did find that, in fact, sorry to trick you with the poll, I just added that question spontaneously. Okay, so we did find for our Black professionals who did work in a very predominantly white workplace context, they did code switch at a moderately high rate, okay? But it really surprised us because we thought this would be the group that would be code switching the most because they're in the numerical minority. But to our surprise, we found that it was actually the Black professionals who worked in the most racially diverse workplace context where there wasn't a single racial majority group. They code switched at the highest degree than anyone else, okay? So at first we were like, wait a minute, what's going on? So of course we had to double, triple check the data to make sure that this was correct and everything was coded correctly. But in fact, that is what the data was telling us. But as we sat with this really and read their qualitative excerpts that we received too, it started to make a lot more sense of why their rates of code switching are higher. Because, okay, if you are working in a predominantly white space, yes, you work code switching the entire time you're at work from that 9 to 5. But because your space is dominated by one racial group, you have to switch into one kind of racial profile and you stay in that same racial profile all day. But if you already tend to code switch and your workplace looks like this, then you can't stay in the same profile every day. Depending on who you're interacting with, which client, which coworker, which supervisor, you're now changing that self-presentation multiple times throughout the same day because you're probably talking to each of these people multiple different times. So that requires an even more advanced level of code switching, of having to learn those social norms and dynamics of multiple cultural groups as opposed to just one cultural group. So I'm going to play a video for you that kind of puts this type of code switching in a racially diverse workplace context into action.
Hola, amiguita. Hola, amiguita, ¿cómo estás? Qué chula te ves. Te veo. Okay.
How you doing?
I'm better now. Oh, hey, Black Queen. Hey, Black Queen. How you doing, man? Get popping. ¿Qué lo que, Gabriel? Tú sabes aquí, tranquilo, quién. Tú sabes. Oh, good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. How was your weekend?
It was good. How was yours?
I was good. I was good. I went hiking.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah.
Good.
Have a good one.
You too.
Okay, so I love that video because it makes me chuckle every time. But you can see how that same individual code switched to multiple different cultural backgrounds within the same day. I also want to highlight that it's very likely that in that situation, this individual's code switching was probably more voluntary in that case, where from their coworkers at equal rank, equal status, they may have not had a code switch to that degree, but they just naturally were inclined to code switch with those individuals because that can build better rapport amongst coworkers and colleagues. All right, so another question time. All right, so how much do you think code switching has contributed to your career success or educational success? Not at all, slightly, somewhat, moderately, or extremely. So how many people would say not at all? Okay, slightly. Somewhat, moderately, okay, and extremely. Okay, whoa, all right, extremely came through, okay. So how about, do we have the poll results from Zoom yet? Okay, so on Zoom, it looks like somewhat and moderately were the two most common responses. All right. So let me jump into now some of our published results on code switching, okay? So this is a project that I published with Courtney and members of my research lab, looking at to what degree is our perceptions of code switching, to what degree does code switching influence our perceptions of professionalism amongst both Black and white Americans across the United States? So this is an experimental study that we published in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology in 2021. And we really wanted to know, do Black and white Americans both perceive code switching the same way? And are they likely to judge a Black individual, a coworker, the same way, depending on whether they choose to code switch or not code switch? And this is when they're explicitly told this individual's either code switching or they're not code switching. Okay, so one of the primary questions driving the study is, does racial code switching influence perceptions of professionalism? So in this experimental study, we manipulated whether a hypothetical Black coworker either engaged in racial code switching behaviors or decided not to engage in racial code switching behaviors, and reported that I typically behave the same way outside of work as I do at work. So participants were then asked to evaluate the advice they received from this hypothetical Black coworker who worked at a law firm in a large metropolitan city. And when they received the information from this coworker, essentially the information from the coworker was describing the unspoken ways to succeed at the firm. So we recruited our participants online, and as soon as they were recruited into the study, consented, we then told them to imagine you were just hired at a new law firm, okay? We're gonna have a more experienced coworker from your law firm reach out to you and send you some communication about the law firm. So in study one, the participants received a voicemail from this hypothetical coworker at the law firm. And in this voicemail, it kind of gave them the inside scoop of, hey, this is what worked for me. This is how you can thrive at this law firm, okay? And in that advice, the individual we manipulated whether the same exact behaviors that either reported code switching those behaviors or being natural and not code switching across those behaviors. All right, so what were the behaviors that we manipulated? So the first behavior was style of speech. So in this advice that the hypothetical coworker was giving, they said that they either, the individual always said that they typically speak in more of African-American vernacular of English, but they said when they're at work, they intentionally change the way that they talk to fit more of a mainstream dialect at work, okay? That's the code switching condition. In the non-code switching condition, they said they typically stay and speak natural and authentic, whether they're at work or not, in their natural style of speech. We also manipulated name preference, okay? So we gender matched the coworkers with the participants' gender as well. So women in the study received the contact from Lakeisha Renee Jackson, and then men in the study received the contact from Lamar Matthew Jackson, okay? So if you notice these names, Jackson was the last name for both of them, but it's not on the screen here. But if you notice their first name, Lakeisha and Lamar, is more an African-American sounding first name. But the middle name is more of a racially ambiguous name. We actually pilot tested these names as well too, and asked individuals, what racial group does it trigger when you hear this name? And we found the exact results you would expect. The Lakeisha Lamar triggered a Black racial group, and Renee and Matthew really didn't trigger any specific racial group. It was just ambiguous, could apply to any racial group, all right? So in the code switching condition, the individual says that outside of work, they prefer to go by their first name, which is either Lakeisha or Lamar, but at work, they actually go by either Renee or Matthew because it's easier for their colleagues to, I forget the exact wording what we say, but they said their colleagues are more receptive to that name. So they intentionally go by their middle name at work, but their first name outside of work. In the non-code switching condition, the individual reports going by their first name, both outside of work and inside of work, okay? So being authentic in that way. All right, and the last behavior we manipulated was hairstyle, okay? So in both conditions, the individual reports that they prefer to wear their hair in a natural hairstyle, like the way it actually grows out of their head. But in the code switching condition, for the female variants, for the female version, they report straightening their hair primarily just for work because that fits more of a European aesthetic. And for the males, they report cutting their hair pretty short, like a short haircut at work because that's the aesthetic that is preferred. In the non-code switching condition, they wear the natural hairstyle both at work and outside of work, okay? So these are the 3 behaviors of code switching that we manipulated. And as I mentioned, in study 1, participants listened to a voicemail where the individual over the voicemail described navigating these 3 same behaviors. And in the second study, we used the exact same script, but instead of hearing it over a voicemail, we put it into a very professional looking email on a professional law firm letterhead and sent it to the participants with the same exact script on it. All right, so Black and white Americans were recruited for the study. It was a 2x2 between subject design. The first condition was the participant's race, whether they identified as Black or white. And the second condition was whether the hypothetical coworker who was always Black that they received the information from, whether that coworker code switched or reported not code switching. All right, so I'll just quickly move through the sample demographics. Study 1 had 314 folks, balanced by gender and race, and study 2 had 450 folks. We controlled for age and household income across each of the studies. All right, so what did we find? So for study 1, in terms of the perceived professionalism that the participants reported based on the colleague that they received this advice from, we found a significant main effect for both the men and the women in the study. So we split the analyses for men and the women separately in the study because they were gender matched with a hypothetical character that matched their gender identity. Okay, so in terms of that main effect, we found that both Black and white Americans both perceived the code switching coworker as more professional than the non-code switching coworker, okay? This effect was almost nearly identical between Black and white participants. And you can see the means right there. So when we looked at the interaction between the race of the participants and the condition, we actually found no significant interactions. So overall, it's just that main effect that both Black and white Americans both similarly agree that Black coworkers who code switch they perceive them as more professional. Now in study 2, the results were actually stronger for study 2. And keep in mind, study 2 is now receiving that same exact information in an email versus hearing it over a voicemail. One reason why we think the results are stronger in study 2 is because reading it in an email, you're probably more likely to retain that information than simply hearing it over a voicemail. They might have not remembered every single detail by hearing it over a voicemail as opposed to reading it in an email. Okay, so in this 2x2 interaction between the participant's race and the condition, we replicated that main effect for code switching. So for both Black men and white men, they still rated the Black coworker who code switched as more professional, but we did find the significant racial interaction in the non-code switching condition. So in this condition, Black Black men were less likely to penalize the individual for not code switching by perceiving them as less professional, but white men did perceive that individual as less professional compared to Black men, and only in the non-code switching condition, but no difference in the code switching condition. All right, this exact effect replicated for the women in the study, same exact trend, overall main effect, where overall the code switching condition perceived as more professional, but we did see this racial difference in the non-code switching condition. All right, so now let's highlight some of those specific behaviors of code switching to see how our participants felt about those, okay? And this is where things get a little interesting. So in terms of style of speech, there was just a significant main effect. So both white and Black Americans agreed, and they both agreed with the code switching coworker, where they felt that, yes, this individual should be code switching their style of speech at this law firm. Now, in terms of the name preference, there was also a significant main effect and not a significant interaction where both Black and white Americans both similarly agreed. But in this case, it was surprising. They both agreed with the non-code switching coworker in this case, where, and fortunately, we had an open-ended question after each of these behaviors, because we really want to know the psychology of why do you feel that way? And when it comes to name selections, a lot of our participants were so highly opposed to code switching your name in the workplace. And the most common response that came across is that they reported that your name is tied to your identity and who you are, and you shouldn't have to change your identity just to fit in at work. So we thought that was interesting. We're like, oh, that's like the whole purpose of code switching. But we felt that they thought that the name should be off limits because that's who you are and your personality. So they literally reported in their responses that that's going too far to change your name at work, and that's not okay, and that shouldn't be allowed. But this also contradicts about 3 decades of resume audit studies that show that when you send the same exact resume out to tens of thousands of jobs, all you have to do is just tweak that last name and make that last name sound either stereotypically Black, Asian, Hispanic, and they're less likely to get, actually the white sounding names on average get 2 to 2.5 times more callbacks for the same exact resumes. And it's so funny because now all these companies use AI to screen all their resumes, but they're getting so many applications where these researchers are still sending the same applications to Amazon, Google, and they're still finding the same exact results even after 3 decades. So names still carry a lot of weight, but when it comes to our participants' perceptions, they didn't like having to change your name at work. So we thought that was pretty interesting. All right, and then the next behavior is hair. And this is where our participants did not agree across racial backgrounds, okay? So we did find a strong racial interaction when it comes to hairstyle, but this interaction was only found for the women in the study and not for the men. For the men, there was overall consensus and agreement with the code switching condition of cutting your hair at work rather than wearing a natural hairstyle as a male at work. But in terms of women, there was not agreement here, and we found exactly opposite responses, okay? So in terms of Black women were in much higher agreement of the non-code switching condition in which the participant wore their natural hairstyle to work. White women did not agree as highly with that hairstyle selection, and we found the inverse effect for the code switching condition. White women were in higher agreement with code switching by straightening your hair at work compared to Black women. All right, so what are the implications of racial code switching? So Black employees who code switch are perceived as more professional overall by both white and Black individuals, so within their racial group as well. And then code switching is correlated, both in our research, it's correlated with professional outcomes, but in other studies, we find that's also correlated with educational outcomes. Teachers tend to respond differently to students, whether they speak proper English versus African-American vernacular or Ebonics. And especially when it comes to even housing too. So similar to those resume audit studies, there have been studies where, actually in linguistics labs, where they've called for rental apartments and housing and called the same exact listing, and the same researchers just changed their dialect and how they spoke and got completely different responses compared to, oh, sorry, that unit's already taken versus, yeah, please come tomorrow and view the unit. So basically getting completely different sets of information based on the dialect that they were speaking over the phone. So overall, these first set of results show that there are some positive outcomes associated with code switching in terms of being perceived as more professional and receiving occupational benefits, educational and housing benefits. But this code switching does come with a cost, okay? So the costs of code switching we find are similar to those costs of emotional masking and identity shifting, where it's just exhausting to have to engage in these behaviors. Because keep in mind, we only measured for 3 behaviors of code switching in that study, but for an individual who does code switch, typically they have to stay consistent across all those behaviors. So you can't really like choose like, I'm just gonna code switch my style of speech, but I'm not gonna code switch my style of dress. Like you usually want these to be more incongruent with one another to, once again, like you're selling a character in a role. So kind of to stay in character in that way. And in addition to code switching being labor intensive and emotionally exhausting, it's also challenging the one's sense of self and identity. So this really speaks to the next line of work I'll be getting into, which gets at when individuals do engage in this type of code switching, they also have to deal with that kind of internal kind of self-doubt and conflict, because most individuals from social identity theory, we value the social groups we identify with. All right, we have a lot of pride in those groups that we affiliate with, but yet when we enter spaces where we can't express our strong affiliation with that group, that can be taxing of having to mask that in certain spaces or to suppress those aspects of your identity. So recent evidence suggests that this self-doubt about authenticity, it may actually be an important mechanism that can explain some of these negative implications of code switching. So potentially this downplaying or masking your identities that we value, that itself can be a major threat to one's identity and help us to explain why code switching can be detrimental. So very little research to date has tested the causal mechanisms underlying why code switching can be taxing and toxic. And even less research has tested these effects of racial code switching in real time, all right? So as you can see, that's exactly some of the goals that we are trying to accomplish right now. So I'll share with you a current study that we're still in the process of finalizing the analyses for this project, but I'm happy to share with you and I'd love to get your opinions on this research. So for this project, we wanted to know what are the psychological and cognitive implications of racial code switching in real time during a controlled laboratory experiment, where we can bring individuals into the lab and then socially prime them to experience that pressure to code switch, or we can socially prime them to just be natural and be themselves, be authentic. So we also want to know, does this self-doubt about one's authenticity, does that actually function as this important mediating mechanism that can explain some of the further downstream consequences of racial code switching? So our sample were 111 Black college students attending a large public university in the Midwest. I won't tell you which one, but they all came into a research lab. So the average age of our sample was 20 years old, and we had 79% of the sample identified as female. All right, so this is kind of like a rough cut and dry version of the procedures that we use. So participants came into our research lab, they consented to the study, we introduced the study to them. So we had to use a bit of deception, okay? So they were recruited for a study about positive mentoring dynamics. And they came into the study, we said, thank you for coming to the study. We're gonna have you engage in an interview with an expert panel who's gonna evaluate your own mentoring experiences and your mentoring beliefs and ideals. Kind of like, think about like your teaching statement for everyone who's been on the job market. It's kind of like we interviewed them with like that teaching statement in mind of what are your values as a mentor? What are your strengths and weaknesses, all right? And they're being evaluated by this expert panel. So right after that, we then had them give a first set of self-report measures. We then had them complete our cognitive task, which was a working memory task, where you have to count a series of numbers on a screen, and every single iteration, the digits of the numbers get longer and longer, but you have to retain all the previous screens of numbers that were presented in front of you. So as you're counting new digits, you have to retain old digits, and the task gradually gets harder and harder and harder and harder as the trials go on. So next, this is where the manipulation happens. So before going into that interview, we then manipulated the priming instructions that they received. And I'll share those instructions with you in just a second. One set of instructions encouraged them to code switch. The other set encouraged them to act natural. Then they engaged in a 3-minute speech/interview with the expert panel. We utilized the Trier social stress task. And this is the task where the panel is already explicitly told to hold a neutral, stoic face and to show no emotional reaction. So they're not getting any positive validations, no head nods, no affirmations. So as you can imagine, even though they're not giving you any negative emotions, if you're giving an interview and the panel's just staring at you, blank face, everyone assumes that they're failing the interview, okay? Because you're not getting any of that validation and confirmation. So it stresses out everyone in the interview. We then have them complete another set of self-reports, same measures, and then complete that cognitive task again. And then we debriefed them at the end. And surprisingly, a good amount of our participants said, thank God that the interview was not real. So it was a Zoom recording that they really thought it was a real live panel. And it took us months to perfect that video to make it look real because the pandemic, our students have a lot of experience on Zoom. All right, so these are the speech instructions they received. All participants received the same instructions. The first set said, in just a moment, you will deliver a brief speech explaining why you will be a good mentor. We would like you to discuss your prior mentoring experiences, including your strengths and weaknesses as a mentor, as well as the things you like and dislike about mentoring. Now, in the act natural condition, they received this set of instructions next, which said, during the speech, we encourage you to act natural and be yourself with members of the mentoring organization. People who typically receive the highest ratings are able to show that they can be authentic in terms of how they behave and carry themselves, all right? So we really wanted to push be authentic. In the code switching edition, their variant then said, during the speech, we encourage you to demonstrate that you can easily relate to the members of the mentoring organization. People who typically receive the highest ratings are able to show that they can fit in with other members in terms of how they behave and carry themselves. So we essentially said code switch without saying the words code switch. But all of our participants, they understood the assignment pretty clearly. So to further encourage them to actually engage in these behaviors, we then put a financial incentive based on these ratings. Where right after this, we said, by the way, if you get one of the highest ratings in our study, we'll give you a $5 bonus for the study, but the ratings dependent on what the panel says about your interview. So in that case, they were incentivized to try to perform well. All right, so I'm going to move quickly because I realize I'm running short on time. So here are our predictions. We expected that the code switching condition will be negatively associated with our positive outcomes and then associated with greater negative outcomes. We also predicted that being in the code switching condition should lead to a greater sense of self-doubt about your authenticity, and then that should in turn explain lower positive outcomes and greater negative outcomes. All right, here are our measures. I'm just going to quickly keep moving. If you have questions about them, happy to answer them. But I'm just going to jump straight into the results. All right. So in terms of our perceived outcomes, so this was the kicker. Almost immediately after we launched data collection, because we video recorded them as well, we noticed that regardless of what condition the participants were in, keep in mind, everyone fails the interview. So because of that, we could not stop the sample from code switching. No matter what condition they were in, everybody code switched. All right. So with that in mind, we found that in terms of our study condition of act natural versus code switching, there was no mean difference in their self-reported rates of code switching at the end of the study, okay? So this shocked us, but keep in mind our sample are Black undergraduates at U of M who have experience at a predominantly white university. A lot of them probably have a lot of experience already code switching in their classes, acting with their peers. So when they're put under a situation of duress, it's very likely would you default onto that safety mechanism of let me switch to code switching now. And they did this even with risking that financial incentive for the act natural condition. But we did find that our mediators still did explain a lot of these effects. So those in the code switching condition reported significantly higher self-doubts about their authenticity, and this further then predicted higher rates of self-reported code switching at the end of the study. This indirect effect was significant. We also found that in terms of how they rated their own speech performance, those in the code switching condition, once again, higher self-doubt, and this then predicted lower speech performance at the end of the study. And a significant indirect effect was also significant through the self-doubt. And then in terms of their perceived capabilities during the interview, we also found the exact same identical effect as well too, where through self-doubt, those in the code switching condition are experiencing lower perceived capabilities. All right, in terms of our affective, which are our emotional responses, so throughout the study at the beginning and then at the end, we asked them to self-report on their positive emotions that they're experiencing. So we found that code switching was once again associated with the self-doubt, and that was associated with lower positive outcomes. Lower positive emotions. This indirect effect was significant. And then as well, through self-doubt, this was associated with greater negative emotions. And keep in mind, this is after controlling for their baseline level of emotions, so we're essentially predicting that change in their emotional state during the study. All right, now for our meta stereotypes, in terms of competence stereotypes, these are stereotypes that you feel that the panel is forming about your level of competence. So even after controlling for their baseline levels, we still found this indirect effect. So I have to say the indirect effect was the p-value was that evil 0.06. So right on the cusp, so a marginal trend towards significance. And then in terms of the stereotypes regarding warmth that they felt the panel formed about them, there were just no effects there. All right, now this is the kicker. And I'm sorry I got to move through this so quickly. But for the working memory task we had them do, for recall accuracy, there was just no variance there. Our sample is very bright. Everyone got almost every response correct, which was surprising because this was a challenging task. So just no variance there. But where there was a lot of variance was that latency of how long did it take them to get that correct answer on this difficult working memory task. And for those, essentially a longer response time means that you're performing worse at the task because it's taking you longer to think and get that correct answer. So unfortunately, our mediating mechanism self-doubt was not associated with the recall latency. So in this case, a shorter response time means you actually performed better at the working memory task. Oh, okay. I'll repeat the question then. Go ahead.
I was wondering if you have any thoughts on, do you think the emotional costs of not code switching versus code switching are comparable? Because when you code switch, there is a sense, there could be a sense of self-doubt and, you know, a lack of authenticity that can consciously affect someone's emotions.
Mhm.
And then on the non-code switching side, you're more aware of how people might be perceiving you based on the stereotypes. And so I was wondering if you have any thoughts on whether or not they're comparable, or if there is, I mean, we saw that there is benefits, quote unquote benefits of code switching, but I was just wondering about the emotional costs of if they're, similar.
Yeah, great question. So to repeat the question for those on Zoom, the question was in regards to the emotional cost of code switching versus not code switching, how those might compare to each other. Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that question because I think the emotional cost of the code switching, we haven't given it enough attention yet, because that's an internal conflict that other people won't be able to see. They're not going to be aware of, but individuals are going to have to deal with that internalized sense of self-doubt. And I think that's a major kind of risk factor that we have to take into consideration. So our next step is to see how that relates to mental health outcomes, to see if it's being correlated with anxiety levels, depression levels, because if that is, then these are clinical health outcomes that show that, yes, this is having a health effect. The part I didn't share about the study is that we also collected saliva samples to get at their cortisol levels to see was their hormonal change in terms of stress levels. We also connected them to medical grade physiological equipment for the whole study. So we were measuring their heart rate, blood pressure, cardiac output, and a full ECG at the millisecond level. So we have over 1 gigabyte of data for every participant. So my RAs every day are cleaning through that data so that we can start to analyze it to see at that micro level, how is their body changing physiologically to this stress? And my guess is that I bet it's correlated to that sense of self-doubt. And what I think is really interesting is that that's their self-reported self-doubt. But my hypothesis, I think our body knows us better than we even know ourselves. So the part of code switching I didn't highlight, well, a little bit, was conscious intentional code switching versus that automatic subconscious code switching. And for individuals who have been code switching for years and years at hand, it's kind of like a muscle memory, where if you do any activity long enough, kind of like think about walking. So at some point we all had to learn to walk, like left foot, right foot, but now we can not juggle, but we can text, we can talk, we can do many things while we're walking because we don't have to think about the actual process of walking. That muscle memory kicks in. And I think that's how code switching functions as well, where if you do it for long enough, then all you need is just a social cue or someone entering a room and your code switching is going to kick in. You don't have to consciously think about doing it if you've been doing it for years. So on a self-report level, people might say who are like, let's say, experienced code switchers, on a self-report measure, they may say, oh yeah, it's not really that stressful, or I don't really do it that much. But that's because their mind is so adaptive and the plasticity, it's taking that out of their conscious awareness. They don't have to think about that all the time. But I don't know if their body's on the same page. So I think their physiological health might be on a different page and realize like, hey, you're under stress, but the mind is so powerful that mind is protecting their conscious awareness from even being attuned or aware of that duress that they're under. So only through these lab experiments of bringing people in the lab, I mean, it's we connect them to all types of equipment when they're in the lab, but we can start to see how their body is reacting in real time to this type of stress. So hopefully in about 6 months to a year, I'll have more answers for you, but we're really interested in really teasing out these questions.
There is a question on Zoom. We'll do that one next. So if you want to do Danielle.
Okay, so the question from Danielle is, how can we get added to the listserv for this project and its future publications? Okay, Danielle, so I recommend, so Google Scholar, if you go to my Google Scholar page, we will post all the publications will be there. I always try to retweet them as well too. So my last slide was a shameless plug to my Twitter account, which is just Dr. Durkee, at Dr. Durkee on Twitter, just Dr. Durkee. But every time we publish new papers, I always try to promote them on Twitter. Okay, can we go to the question in the room? Yep.
Oh, okay. So you have to specify that like the research was done in the pre-pandemic era, but of course like the world is getting increasingly digital and we have like the meetings and
Yeah.
reduction in like face-to-face. So how does like code switching manifest in like online the communication, and there's like a digital code switching?
Yeah, I am so glad you asked that question. We have a study that we're writing up to send out for publication. I'm glad I didn't include it in this presentation because I wouldn't have time to do it. But when the pandemic hit, we wanted to know to what degree are people code switching at home. So we recruited another sample of several hundred Black professionals who were all working from home remotely full time, okay? And we asked them the same questions: to what degree are you code switching? To our surprise, their rates of code switching were actually higher than it was for the sample 2 years prior who were in person. So we did not expect to see that for the rates of code switching to go up. We kind of figured they would be lower because you're in the comfort of your home. So 2 caveats to consider. This is, we collected this data in 2020 after the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor murder. So race was very salient on everyone's mind. So because, and we were having racial conversations with colleagues that we normally would never talk about race with, but it was just on everyone's mind. So given that time, I think that also kind of elevated the racial salience for our participants for their rates of code switching to be higher. The other thing too is that when you're working from home, and this is still during the pandemic where the schools were still opening and closing. So for a lot of our professionals who had kids, their kids were also at home in school with them. So now you have to be mom and vice president at the same time.
Sorry.
Other questions?
We have question, will slides be shared? Yes, we can share them if you're okay with it.
Yep.
Okay. So slides will be shared.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you all for your attention and your questions. I really appreciate it. Feel free to reach out to me and follow up if you have any follow-up questions, or if you have any suggestions of why also too that working memory benefit from the code switching condition. We did not expect that. So we've thrown a lot of variables at that to try to explain it, but so far nothing has been working. Can we pass